I didn't expect my evening to start with a chokehold. 1 second I was stepping out onto my porch to check a noise, and the next, 2 HOA security guards, men I'd only seen handing out parking violation slips, slammed me face first into my own gravel driveway. Their boots dug into my back, plastic zip ties biting into my wrists as one of them barked, "You're trespassing on HOA property." My house, my driveway, my property. And they were calling me the intruder. But the real problem wasn't just their stupidity. It was their fear. They weren't acting like security. They were acting like men who knew they'd made a huge mistake but were doubling down anyway. I kept trying to explain that I lived there, but every word was met with another shove or threat. They kept looking over their shoulders toward my front door, whispering to each other like they expected someone to burst out at any moment. Little did I know someone was inside. 2 someones, actually. And they were the last people the HOA ever wanted to cross. As they dragged me toward their golf cart. Yeah, their plan was to haul me off in a glorified toy car. I noticed my door slightly open. The deadbolt had been kicked in. That's when my stomach dropped. I had been outside grilling for 10 minutes. If they'd broken in before tackling me. The panic in the guards' voices suddenly made sense. Inside my house were 2 retired Marine veterans. My uncles. Both of them stubborn, battle-hardened, and currently visiting for the weekend. Both of them the type to consider a broken door an invitation for controlled chaos. The guards hadn't realized they'd just trapped themselves in the middle of a nightmare they created. As the golf cart sputtered to life, a thunderous crash echoed from inside the house. One guard froze. The other swallowed hard, his eyes darting between me and the doorway like he was choosing which disaster would kill him first. Then came the voice, steady, calm, and dangerous. "You boys better explain why you're in my nephew's house." The guards turned pale. I almost felt bad for them. Almost. Because the next 10 minutes would decide everything. My freedom, their jobs, and the HOA's biggest scandal. Every sound from the house grew louder. The shuffle of boots, the creak of floorboards, the unmistakable thump of someone being pinned to a wall. The guards exchanged terrified glances, realizing escape was no longer an option. I could see the regret flooding their faces, but it was far too late. My uncles weren't the type to ask questions first. They acted fast and decisive, especially when family was involved. The tension rose sharply as silence suddenly fell inside completely. The silence was deafening. The HOA guards sat frozen in the golf cart, their hands still gripping my zip-tied wrists, as if letting go would somehow undo the terror creeping over their faces. I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. The sound from inside the house, a low, controlled growl of authority, was all anyone needed to know. This was no ordinary confrontation. Then came the footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, and impossibly calm. One of the guards finally whispered, We didn't know anyone was here." His voice cracked like a child admitting to a sin. I wanted to laugh, but the threat was real. One wrong move, and I'd still be zip-tied, completely at their mercy. The veterans didn't move yet. They made them sweat first. A window rattled upstairs. My uncle's silhouette appeared briefly, the kind of imposing shadow that made even the sun seem timid. "You're lucky I'm feeling charitable today," he said slowly, voice low, carrying the weight of someone who'd lived through hell and come out alive. "Otherwise, you'd be learning about military-grade patience the hard way." The guards' faces paled, their bravado evaporating like mist in the morning sun. They hadn't prepared for real warriors, and the realization hit them like a sledgehammer. Every drill, every tip on how to handle residents, suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the skill of 2 Marines defending their kin. I felt a strange mix of fear and relief. Fear, because I was still tied up like a mannequin in some horror movie. Relief, because my family's presence made it clear the tables had turned. Inside, every room echoed with controlled chaos, shouts, the dull thump of bodies, the snap of tactical discipline. It was like watching a slow-motion storm, precise, overwhelming, inevitable. Minutes dragged on like hours. The guards shifted nervously, exchanging panicked whispers. "We should leave," one muttered. But even the word leave felt impossible in that moment. My uncles had cut off all paths. Every door, every hallway was a calculated trap. They weren't just inside my house, they had turned it into a fortress. Finally, one guard made a fatal mistake. He moved too fast, trying to pry at the zip ties holding me. That's all it took. My uncle appeared from the stairs like a phantom, hand raised not in violence but in pure command. "Step back, now!" The golf cart creaked and groaned as it shifted under the guards' weight. They were trapped, surrounded, and exposed. I watched their faces go from cocky entitlement to sheer terror in the span of seconds. For the first time, I felt like the tables had fully turned. And then came the question that would seal their fate. "Do you know who you just tried to mess with?" My uncles didn't wait for an answer. They simply advanced, each step echoing authority and experience. I could only hope they were ready for what came next. The tension inside the house was unbearable. I could hear every step, every movement, every shallow breath of the HOA guards as they realized just how outmatched they were. My uncles moved with a precision that came only from years of combat experience. Silent, deliberate, and terrifyingly efficient. The walls of my home, once ordinary and comforting, suddenly felt like the arena for a showdown these men had never anticipated. The first guard tried to pull at the zip ties again, desperation creeping into his movements. He stammered, we thought... But his words were cut short by a sharp, commanding voice. "Stop! Now!" My uncle's presence alone could freeze a man mid-sentence, and it showed. The guard froze, eyes wide, realizing that the house he thought he was in control of was now a cage, one where every corner concealed someone capable of serious harm. The second guard fumbled for his radio, hoping backup would arrive. He pressed it frantically, but there was no signal. No help was coming. He glanced at me, eyes pleading, but I could do nothing. My hands were still tied, my voice still restrained. I felt like a spectator trapped in a nightmare I couldn't escape, watching two men whose confidence I had always underestimated dismantle the illusion of control these guards had clung to. Then came the sound of boots behind them, heavier this time, deliberate, like someone walking with purpose toward inevitability. My other uncle had positioned himself near the kitchen, effectively cutting off their escape. The guards' faces drained of color. Their bravado evaporated completely. We don't want trouble," one said, voice shaking. "Trouble?" my uncle echoed, voice cold and low. "You call breaking into a family home trouble? You just made a grave mistake." Time seemed to slow as the two guards realized they had no options. Every exit, every path, every chance of controlling the situation had vanished. They were surrounded by people who didn't just know how to defend. They knew how to dominate. The first guard tried a sudden dash toward the front door. That was all it took. A single calculated movement from my uncle stopped him in his tracks, a hand gripping his shoulder like iron. The second guard froze, understanding too late that the house wasn't just my home anymore. It was a battlefield, and they were outgunned, outsmarted, and completely exposed. I could finally breathe a little, even as I remained tied up, because I knew my uncles would handle the situation. But I also knew the story wasn't over. The guards were not going to forget this. And the HOA? They were about to face consequences they never imagined. The room was silent now, tension thick enough to choke on. The first words from my uncle would decide the next move, and ultimately, who walked out of my house free, and who didn't. The room was thick with tension, each second stretching like an eternity. The HOA guards, still pale and frozen, finally realized that charm, excuses, or authority badges meant nothing here. My uncles were in full control, their eyes scanning every inch of the room, assessing, calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And strike they would, but with precision, not chaos. The first guard tried to speak again, his voice barely a whisper. "Please. We can explain." But the words fell flat, swallowed by the authority emanating from my uncles. One step forward from either of them was enough to crush any lingering confidence the guards had. Years of Marine training weren't just in muscle memory, they were in presence, in posture, in the subtle weight of authority that made even grown men hesitate. I remained tied, heart pounding, watching as the uncles executed a series of maneuvers that I could only describe as tactical poetry. The first guard was guided to kneel, not roughly, but with a deliberate firmness that communicated dominance. The second was instructed to stand against the wall, hands raised, his earlier swagger completely erased. There was no cruelty, only control, a demonstration of what happens when amateurs cross people who understand consequences. And then came the moment that made me realize the HOA guards had truly underestimated the situation. One uncle stepped closer to the front door and retrieved a set of keys. "You broke in," he said, voice calm but deadly. "Now, you'll leave with your dignity, and a very clear warning. Or, you'll leave with consequences you can't undo." The guards looked at each other, the weight of their poor decisions finally sinking in. The realization that this wasn't just a misunderstanding, they had trespassed, attacked, and now faced two Marines ready to enforce justice, was written across their faces. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in, every shadow a reminder of how far they'd overstepped. I could finally wiggle my wrists, the zip ties loosened just enough by my uncle to let me feel relief creeping in. Freedom was near, but not yet granted. I remained a witness, my pulse synced with the deliberate pacing of my uncles as they prepared for the final move. One uncle spoke again, his tone almost conversational but carrying undeniable authority. "You've learned a lesson tonight. Remember it. Respect people, respect property, and never underestimate who's inside." The guards nodded frantically, swallowing hard, their earlier arrogance entirely gone. The tension that had been suffocating the room slowly lifted, replaced by a chilling understanding. This night would haunt them far longer than they would ever admit. And just when it seemed the ordeal was ending, my uncles paused at the doorway, exchanging a look that said one last action was coming, something neither guard would forget. The final act was about to unfold, and you could feel the energy in the room shift. My uncles exchanged a single glance, silent communication honed from years of trust and battlefield experience. Then, with deliberate calm, they moved. The first guard's knees buckled slightly as he realized his fate wasn't just about being caught. It was about being taught a lesson he'd never forget. "You're leaving," my uncle said, voice low, deliberate, carrying the weight of authority that no badge could ever match. "But not until you understand exactly what you did wrong." The guards nodded, trembling, their earlier bravado completely gone. The second guard tried to stammer an excuse, but my uncle raised a single hand. Silence fell like a hammer striking an anvil. Then came the most unnerving part. My uncles had coordinated their movements with military precision. One moved to retrieve the broken HOA clipboard from the floor, evidence of their intrusion, while the other calmly swept through the living room, ensuring nothing else in the house had been disturbed. Their methodical approach left no room for panic, no opportunity for them to misinterpret weakness. The guards, now fully aware of how thoroughly they had miscalculated, were visibly shrinking under the weight of their mistake. They were trapped not by zip ties or doors, but by sheer competence and the imposing presence of trained Marines who had nothing to prove and everything to protect. Finally, the moment of release came. My uncles gestured for me to untie myself, and as I did, I felt a surge of gratitude and relief. The immediate danger was over, but the lesson was clear. Never underestimate the people you cross. The guards were left standing, broken in spirit, their attempts at intimidation completely nullified. Before letting them leave, my uncle spoke one last time. "Consider tonight your wake-up call. Trespass again, and it won't be warnings you get, it'll be consequences you can't undo. Understand?" The nods were frantic, almost desperate, as the guards tried to absorb the gravity of the moment. Their earlier confidence had crumbled entirely. As they finally exited my house, the evening sun casting long shadows over the driveway, I realized how close we had come to a disaster that could have escalated far beyond what anyone expected. But my uncle's presence, their experience, and their unwavering resolve had turned what could have been chaos into controlled, decisive justice. I collapsed onto the couch, heart still racing, listening to the quiet after the storm. My house, my sanctuary, was safe again. And the guards? They had learned a lesson the hard way, one they would carry with them forever. Tonight, the HOA learned something crucial. Never underestimate who's inside the house, and never forget that family can be the most formidable defense of all.